Now, it's my distinct honor to introduce our president, the president of Pi Gamma Mu, Dr. Susan Kinsella. Dr. Kinsella is a social work scholar and former dean of the College of Education and Social Services at St. Leo University. She's currently a professor in the online Graduate Human Services Administration program at St. Leo. She's been a part of Pi Gamma Mu for over 20 years, and her roles have included serving as the chapter faculty sponsor at both Bruin Parker College and St. Leo University, which had been award-winning chapters under her leadership. She was a Pi Gamma Mu governor for the state of Georgia, a chancellor for our Southeast region, and the chair of several important committees. She's been the first vice president and now is our president. Dr. Kinsella launched our speaker series in November of 2022, and her lecture focused on the field of animal-assisted interventions. A recording of that is available on our YouTube channel. Thank you for your amazing service, Dr. Kinsella. Now I will hand it off to you to introduce our wonderful speaker today.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for those wonderful Zoom skills that you use too. We really appreciate that. And thank you for everybody who is participating today with the speaker series from Pi Gamma Mu, which is our International Honor Society in the Social Sciences. So we're excited everyone is here, and we're pleased to bring you the second speaker in the series this year. As our speaker does proceed today with the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And when we finish the presentation, Dr. Weikert will address them at the end. So today, Dr. Joshua Weikert is from Immaculata University from Pennsylvania. He is presently an associate professor and chair of the Department of Civic Engagement at Immaculata University and a policy advisor to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He has a wide-ranging academic and practice career in politics and public policy, combining rigorous research and teaching experience with real-world policy and governing experience. His course roster covers topics in American government, public policy, European politics, law, and political communication. He has also served as a research consultant, policy analyst, and legislative advisor for governments and political campaigns. Today, Dr. Weikert will speak about the interplay between politics and public policy in legislatures. He will tell us that politics and policy are related but distinct areas of public activity, and nowhere do they come together more directly than in a legislative environment. His presentation will include the role of public opinion and interest groups, party competition, majority-minority dynamics, and the challenges of developing good policy options to address public concerns in a multi-level competitive environment. Sociological, behavioral, and structural theories of political leadership will also be brought to bear. Dr. Weikert is the chapter faculty sponsor of the Pennsylvania Alpha Rho chapter of Pi Gamma Mu at Immaculata University. We are pleased that he could join us today. Please welcome Dr. Josh Weikert.
Thank you very much, President Kinsella, and everyone who's joining us. Thank you very much for being here today. I forgot that I had written that summary, and I'm very happy to say that the notes that I prepared for today did match that description. So good news on that front. So we'll be able to work from those. Yeah, my plan today is really quite simple. I want to talk to you all about how legislatures are constituted, how they're actually constructed, how they function as institutions, and then also how individuals within them tend to function. And this is based on my experience in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and also just studying and working with legislatures at the local level, state level, and federal level as well. I should start by saying I'm not a politician, and I will resist that term for as long as I possibly can. And people try to hang it on me sometimes, but it's simply not true. Political science is not government, and government is not political science, and being a politician and being a political scientist are not quite the same things, but they do tend to run in similar circles. So as was mentioned, I'm an associate professor of politics at Immaculata University, and I think of myself as a professor. It's all I've really ever wanted out of my professional life is to be a politics professor at a small liberal arts university. And so mission accomplished there. It makes me very happy. Everything else is sort of secondary to that, but related to it. I'm Chief of Staff and Policy Director for the 150th Legislative District in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. I also advise my local government and our comprehensive planning committee. I'm a selectee for a U.S. Army Reserve program in civil affairs to be a civil affairs officer as a functional specialist in law, regulation, and policy. So you can see I do my best to make my life as sort of a scholar practitioner. And something I mention to my students all the time is that learning without application achieves the same ends as ignorance. And I like doing political science, not just studying it. So that's who I am. To start, I mean, we need to define what legislatures are. At a very basic level, legislatures are, deliberative bodies whose main purpose is passing laws. They achieve other functions as well around oversight and representation, but their primary function, what we mostly think of them as doing, is creating and passing laws. Every legislature is different. They're different based on the constitution that creates them. Every state has its own state constitution. The federal government has its constitution, and there are rules that get laid down in those documents around how the legislature is put together, how many chambers it has, how many members it has, how they're selected. And so the Constitution lays down these very basic rules of the field, the rules of the game that define how it functions. But that's just one part of it. The system itself varies from place to place based on those rules as well. You have unicameral legislatures that only have one body, of mostly bicameral legislatures that have two bodies. There are different rules around how bills are passed, and we're not going to do the whole Schoolhouse Rock thing about how a bill becomes a law, but it's always a complicated process, and in no state is it a simple and straightforward process. And then there are actually the norms that go into these institutions as well. There are certain behaviors that are typical in different bodies that develop over time and contribute to their functioning or contribute to their dysfunction, as might also be the case. And then the final thing that makes all legislatures different is that just time makes legislatures different. Members move in and out. They retire. They move on to other elected offices. Sometimes they simply decide to stop holding public office, which is not that uncommon. It should also be noted that in legislatures, members often die in office. It's not a common occurrence, but it does happen. And in every 2 or 4 year, 6 year session, however long the term is, there's always a different body of people at the end than there were at the beginning for all these different reasons. So legislatures are not static institutions, I guess is my takeaway point. They are all different from each other, and they are dynamic. And they become even more so because once you get past the Constitution and the system and the rules and everything, the system, you get to the rules. And to borrow a phrase from William Parker of the Parker Brothers, the rules make the game. The rules define how the body actually functions in practice. And as we saw in the U.S. House when it was going through its speaker election just a couple of months ago, or was it just this month? Wow. As we saw earlier this month, I should say, the rules are often a matter of great contention because how bills get to the floor, how the chamber, how the leadership functions in a chamber, is all going to vary based on these rules. So that the rules are the first thing a legislature will have conflict about. Usually it's quite simple because the majority, as we'll talk about in just one second, can generally do what it likes in most legislatures, but the majority is not always in agreement with what it wants internally. So we can have some issues with that. Now, when we think about successful legislating, we have to define what we mean by success. If we're talking about getting the legislature passed through the chamber and to the governor or president's desk for signature and therefore becoming law, we have to be kind of critical of every legislature that's probably ever existed, because most bills, and this is the first time but not the last time you'll hear me say it, most bills die on their way to the speaker's rostrum. It's a relatively rare occurrence. I've been doing this for the Pennsylvania House at least for the last about 5 years. In that amount of time, I've probably written or had a hand in writing upwards of 110 bills, of which exactly one has become law. So it's a relatively low batting average, but it is nevertheless sort of a contact sport. The more you sort of press and push, the more you're likely to see your agenda enacted. So success may not be legislative. Success may be something else. Success may be about raising the profile and salience of certain issues. Success might be defined by messaging and visibility of the candidate, or of the elected official, him or herself, if they have higher aspirations. So there are different definitions of success. So we should think of them pretty broadly. Now, as I mentioned, legislatures are basically majority cartels. The majority party, the majority cohort, if you have a multi-party system, the majority largely determines what happens in the chamber. The majority decides whom the Speaker of the House is, or the majority leader of a Senate, if that's the system that we're functioning with. Majorities dictate, who sits on committees and how many from each party sit on each committee. They make all these decisions, and the majorities have nearly perfect negative agenda control. They can't necessarily make anything they want happen, because there might be dissension within their own caucus. But they can pretty much guarantee that the minority caucus can get almost nothing of what it wants accomplished, at least not primarily. Bipartisanship, as we'll talk about in just a minute, does play a role. There are also usually some tools in the legislature to move bills that the majority might not want moved. There's something called the discharge petition. If you can get enough members to sign off on a certain type of resolution in most chambers, you can basically yank a bill out of committee, even if the majority doesn't want to let it out of committee, and bring it to the floor. There are ways to challenge the leadership. Something called a motion to vacate the chair. If you want to remove a chair of a committee or remove the speaker of or the presiding member of the chamber, that might be an option as well. Much less common is something like we see in the US Senate with the filibuster, where the minority party can basically prevent action on the floor by basically keeping debate going indefinitely. That's an institution that's kind of unique to the US Senate, and we don't tend to see that anywhere else. So in most legislatures, we're talking about just this pure majority cartel where the majority dictates the behavior on the floor. The best tool that they have for that, the majority, is one of the essential things that come out of modern legislatures, and that is committee structures. Committees are where most of the action happens in a legislature. And in a majority cartel, the committee decides what the committees are, and they may choose to focus on certain topical or policy areas, depending on their agenda. So they might, for example, create a committee on the study of the state's tax system, if it doesn't already exist. And they might create a committee about, to examine state policing policies and crime. So these things can become very granular and very particular. They also, more importantly, decide how many seats each party gets on the committee. And so, as you might imagine, they tend to give themselves a bit of a buffer. There's no rule that committees have to be proportional in most legislatures. In the Pennsylvania legislature, it would not be uncommon to see rules that give 15 seats on the committee to the majority party and 10 seats to the minority party, whomever that is, no matter how closely divided the chamber is, because that way the majority party can handle a couple of defections on a committee and still guarantee that they only let through the bills they want. It is also important to note that committee chairs are near absolute rulers on their committees in most cases. They schedule hearings, they put amendments up for a vote and make changes to the bill language while it's in the committee. And they also, most importantly, decide whether a bill is going to get a vote for what we call reporting out. Reporting out means a bill has been introduced on the floor, it's assigned to a committee. The committee has worked the bill and put it into what it believes is a good final form, at least a tentative final form, because it's often amended from the floor. And then they take a vote on it in committee, and that sort of sends it back out to the floor. But beforehand, it has to go through yet another committee, often called the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee decides when the bill is going to come up for debate, for how long, and they schedule the vote. So the Rules Committee becomes yet another gate that you have to pass through to get bills through the process. Even minority committee chairs tend to enjoy more power than the average member. They work very closely with the majority chair, and there's often a lot of cooperation and bipartisan work that happens there. And plus, in closely divided legislatures whose polarity will shift now and again, the majority chair might be sensitive to the fact that they might soon be the minority chair, and they want to establish a good working relationship that way. But as I said, most bills die in committee. That's where their life ends. This is not necessarily a bad thing. There are thousands of bills introduced in most legislatures in a year. Not all of them need to become law. Some of them are not even intended to become law. Some are test balloons, where we would, for example, propose a bill just to see if there's a significant public reaction to it, positive or negative. If there's a very strong positive reaction to a bill, what might happen is that this small bill gets sort of quietly killed in committee, and then a larger group of more prominent legislators will reintroduce it as something brand new in a few weeks, because now they know it's popular. If it's particularly unpopular, the party who introduced it can always point to it and say, well, that bill was just introduced by some backbench member that we're not even listening to. Pay no attention to that, and then quietly kill it again. Some bills are just symbolic. And by that, I mean, we name a lot of things in legislatures. We name streets and bridges and what have you, and public buildings. And those often are what are often called calendar bills or non-controversial bills or timing bills, if we're naming, a day of awareness for something. And those often don't get through the committee because they're simply shunted off the side and just adopted. And then we also have what are sometimes signaling bills, or these might also be symbolic, where you want to draw attention to a particular issue, especially if it's something of particular interest to your own constituency. I was always sort of laughed at the fact that Senator Chuck Schumer, who's currently the Senate Majority Leader, would often introduce a bill declaring that the proper home of the Dodgers is actually Brooklyn and not Los Angeles, and that Los Angeles should be ashamed of itself for having lured the team away, because Chuck Schumer represents the state of New York, and his constituents find that hilarious and they love it. So, some bills are not meant to be laws. So what goes into success in the legislature? Well, part of it is positional power. Those committee chairs that I mentioned just a moment ago in multiple studies of lots of different legislatures. And as I mentioned, they're all different. So these rules are hard to generalize, but it is generally true that committee chairs enjoy sort of an outsized amount of success and power in getting their legislation adopted, in part because they control one of those important gates of getting bills in and out of committee. And they get to decide what the committee focuses on. And of course, they're going to focus on their own legislation. So that's important if your interest is becoming a successful legislator. Also important, at least potentially, again, not in every case, but also important is sociability, how well members get along with each other. And this matters more in some legislative bodies than others. For example, the US Senate is famous as a highly collegial and social institution. The Pennsylvania House of Representatives, not so much, but like it still matters because legislatures are made up of individual legislators. These are all just people, and they're people who work together. They work long nights. The Pennsylvania House, for example, unlike the U.S. House, if you ever sort of have visited the U.S. House of Representatives in D.C., you'll notice that even when the House is in session, there's almost no one there. It's like whomever is speaking at the rostrum, and maybe a couple of other members and staff just sort of in the galleries and on the floor, but that's pretty much it. They're talking to an empty room. You can't really see that because they lock down the C-SPAN cameras, so you can't pan and see that they're addressing an empty room, but that's not unusual. In the Pennsylvania House, when the House is in session, every member who can be has to be in the chamber. So you're going to spend a lot of time with these people, sometimes long days, long nights, into the weekends at times, especially when we get into budget seasons. And so sociability matters, likability, whether your colleagues think you're someone who can be trusted, who can be worked with, someone who's funny, someone who's been there a while, like your reputation begins to matter. It also matters in practical voting terms on certain bills because there's a phenomenon we call log rolling, which is if I come to you, you're another legislator in the chamber, I'll come up to you and say, look, we neither of us have strong feelings about these two bills of ours, yours and mine. I'll tell you what, you vote for my bill, I'll vote for your bill, and then we'll both chalk up another yes vote. And if it's not something that directly impacts your constituency and or you generally think it's a good idea, but maybe you're on the fence, this might be something that moves you. But that only works if that sociability, if that approach is going to actually be effective. And so if someone doesn't like you, that can be a problem. And I'm not going to pick on any legislator in the United States or outside the country, except for one person. I'm going to pick on Ted Cruz, or rather, I'm not going to pick on Ted Cruz. Lindsey Graham is going to pick on Ted Cruz because Lindsey Graham, famously, who was in the same party as Ted Cruz, talking about Senator Cruz's likability, said that if Ted Cruz were murdered on the floor of the Senate and the trial were held in the Senate, you would not get one vote for conviction. And again, to hear a senator talk about another senator that way is, again, very much outside the norm of collegiality in the U.S. Senate, but it tells you something about how people feel about working with Ted Cruz, right? So you have likability, log rolling, and also longevity matters. The more time you spend in the chamber, the better you know the rules, the more likely you are to be able to get things done. And good legislative leaders are long-term deal makers. Alienating opponents today doesn't just cost you today's vote, it costs you tomorrow's vote as well, and a month from now, maybe a year from now, maybe 10 years from now. And so legislators tend to think in the context not of sort of like, allies and enemies, but more like partners. So on what can we work together? And I've been involved in a number of legislative negotiations where interests run in parallel between multiple members, some often of different parties. And it's possible to build real, cohorts of support for things, which can help move things along. And that relationship building process is an important one. We are not just talking about relationships, though, among members of the chamber. We're also talking about the relationship between the members and the public. Legislators represent, in almost all cases, a specific geographic constituency. That's not always the case. In some places, you have at-large members that represent the entire sort of like, state or county or for example, city councils often run this way where you have a number of at-large members. But by and large, legislators tend to represent some small geographic constituency made up of individuals. And that is a two-way communication process between those members and their constituents. Constituent communications really matter. And by that, I mean they matter to the members. Something I'm often telling students is that if you think elected officials don't care about you when you send them an email or call their office, you are dead wrong. And if anything, you have a louder voice than you might think, because not everyone takes that step of communicating with a legislator. And so when that legislator hears, oh, well, we've gotten 5 emails or 10 phone calls or 1,000 letters on whatever the issue is, they definitely sit up and pay attention. It also matters because very often when the public contacts the legislator, they're asking for something we call casework. they need help with a government agency, they need assistance with filling out forms, they might have some sort of public agency or bureau related problem. And our role is to help them through that problem, whatever it might be. And this can be something as minor as fixing potholes. Lots of legislators literally have just report buttons to report a pothole. Sometimes legislators will call people on their birthday if they hit a sort of 50th birthday or 100th birthday, one of those marquee birthdays. And that's an example of casework and being in touch. My personal favorite when it comes to advising members of the Pennsylvania House is to encourage members to set up lost property searches. Anytime anybody contacts your office, Pennsylvania has a lost and unclaimed property database. Look up that person's name and see if they have any unclaimed property. Because if they call you because they need help with a state tax form, and in the process you happen to find out they have like $220 sitting somewhere in the state agency that they never got refunded, they're going to develop a little bit more affinity for your office and for your member. We also obviously pay attention to constituents in the public when it comes to advising members how to vote and on advising on what policies to introduce. What the public wants, and this is maybe a controversial statement because not everyone believes me when I say it, but by and large, what the public wants, the public tends to get. The formulation that we had way back at the beginning of the Republic with James Madison saying that persistent majorities will tend to get what they want in a democracy and in a republic, it actually is true. And these offices do pay attention to what they hear from their constituents. They don't do exactly what they're told in all cases because members have lots of constituents, and sometimes one view is not the one that's going to predominate. That's just an unavoidable reality, but we do try to at least make sure everyone's voice is represented. And having supervised constituent communications for offices before, I can tell you we put together regular reports for the elected members explaining sort of what the breakdown is on opinions, if there are ideas that came out of it, if there's anything that the public wants that we're not currently pursuing, and should we? Which brings me to maybe my favorite part of this, which is the policy process. Because I primarily work in public policy making. That's my role is to sort of, come up with ideas and respond to ideas that get pitched by other members. To do that, you have to understand how the process works. I'm going to make this as painless as I can, I promise, because I want to get to the end of this in good shape without everyone leaving. The policy process is pretty simple. First of all, we start with problem identification. You have to know something's a problem. And by problem, I don't just mean something negative. I mean something that we want to fix. That's really what makes it a problem. And policy ideas can come from anywhere and anyone. I've gotten good ideas from articles I've read. I've gotten good ideas from constituents. I've got great ideas from interns and other staff. I get ideas from members themselves. And so we can come up with these things from anywhere and, just identifying these problems. And then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we fix it? Which brings us to the second stage, which is policy formulation. Policy formulation is the solution we come up with to try and address whatever the problem is we've identified. And the question of who's making policy becomes very important here. Because the assumption that elected officials make policy is not always accurate. Certainly, candidates run on a platform and they have an agenda and they have ideas about what they would like to see become law. But believe it or not, no matter how broadly run your campaign, there's probably large blank spots where you don't really have a policy position. But suddenly we have some sort of timely issue that comes up, and now we need to come up with something. Okay. That's where people like me and the staff and also the lawyers who work for the caucus come in, where we sit down and start workshopping ideas and coming up with solutions, trying to identify pitfalls, talking to stakeholders, seeing what they might think, because policies can have wide-ranging effects on areas you might never consider when you first propose them as a solution. And we don't want to create new problems. We want to sort of reduce the number of problems. After a policy is formulated, usually some sort of negotiation between the elected officials, the staff, and the lawyers, we go to the policy adoption phase. This is where the bill is introduced, assigned to committee, and all the fun stuff that How a Bill Becomes a Law Schoolhouse Rock taught you. And this is really a time for bargaining, this policy adoption stage. And these negotiations are usually member to member. There's something we want. One of the bills I put forward once was to do a study at the state level of converting our abandoned coal mines into geothermal wells. And we were working with another member's office, and they wanted to see this pitched more as a consumer resources issue as opposed to an environmental issue. And one member wanted to know it's more about the environmental side of things, and there had to be a negotiation process that occurs. But this is when this is supposed to happen. You never get the perfect bill. You never get your perfect bill through the process. There's always some sort of change or adjustment that has to happen. Policy adoption ends, we end up with a vote, and then the fun part is policy implementation and evaluation. This is where the bill goes to the governor's office, to the executive branch, to the president, whomever it might be, and the policy is actually put into practice. And what will happen generally is that legislatures will evaluate these, they'll engage in oversight and see if what they proposed, is being implemented the way they would hope, and to see if it's effective or not. It is a slow process. It is an uncertain process. There is a lot of compromise involved. But the upside of that is that it also tends to be an incremental process. It prevents government from going too far and too fast and doing things the public might not want. Most of the time we see legislatures in conflict. I don't want to give the impression that that's the norm, but I will say that conflict is not necessarily a problem. Conflict is sometimes where the best ideas come from. It's also important to note that this is how legislatures are designed. They're designed to be conflict oriented. They are designed to, set factions against one another. I mean, anytime you call a vote on something, unless it's a unanimous vote on a non-controversial item, there's someone who disagrees, right? So the conflict is not a problem necessarily. And it should be noted that lots of things do get through legislatures without too much fuss. There are any number of bills that pass in a given session that, do not create any particular rancor. It's just that we tend to notice when things go more smooth, or we tend to not notice when things go smoothly. We tend to notice when there's more conflict. So part of this is sort of a bias in how we process the result that we see. Cooperation is not impossible. It should be noted again, though, that it is also not always rational. What I mean by that is this. First of all, what voters say they want isn't necessarily what they reward. Voters say that in almost every poll you'll ever see, you'll see that voters say they want bipartisanship and they want compromise. But members who do that or propose that are often punished by both the people who didn't agree with them in the first place and by the people who did agree with them in the first place, because the people who didn't agree with them in the first place don't like any element of what they're proposing, and the people who did support them before don't like the fact that they're compromising on it, and therefore this person ends up in electoral trouble and now they're out of a job. Whereas people who are sticking to their guns and fighting for you, all these phrases that we tend to drop into political ads, those people tend to be rewarded because people look at them and they understand what that person represents politically. And so they tend to find it easier to build electoral coalitions to stay in office. So that's one problem, is the voters themselves. And I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying we should all look in the mirror. The second part is the role of polarity shifts. In other words, who's in the majority and who is not. Okay. If you are in the majority, if you are in the minority and there's not much chance of that changing, you have an incentive to compromise, because the only shot you have of getting part of your policy into law is by compromising with members in the majority. All right. But now imagine a situation where it's uncertain, where polarity and control shifts from one election to the next. You have a choice to make if you're a member at that point. You can choose to get a little of what you want today. In other words, find a way to compromise. Or you can sort of obstruct all action and get what you want tomorrow, because now you're in the majority. And there's very little incentive at that point to be a cooperative bipartisan worker. The analogy I often make is a food truck. If there was a food truck on site at your job and all they sold was tacos and you weren't a big fan of tacos, but you could go down and buy lunch from the food truck and find something at least you could live with, that would be an option. But if you knew that, not ordering anything would hurt the food truck's business. And in fact, if you knew that lobbying other people not to buy from it either would hurt the business even further, and if maybe you stood in front of the food truck with a sign saying, I just saw a rat running out of the back of this food truck, and you could get them shunted off to the side, at that point, you might get a food truck in that represents your tastes, right? So you have no particular incentive to compromise and sort of take what you can get, okay? Compromise sounds good, and it is good in a lot of cases. But the final note I have on this is that lots of political issues are not positional or spectrum oriented. It is not always the case that one side wants $25 million for this, the other side wants 10 million, and they should just split the difference. There are often differences in actual process and outcomes and substance that cannot simply be, broken down and find the midpoint and everyone just agrees. So there's reason for hope, but we need to be clear-eyed about it. The last thing I have before I take questions, and thank you very much for your patience, by the way, is people often ask me what's good about working in a legislature and what's good about legislatures in general. And the first thing I always say is that one of the best things is that legislatures are designed to take on a lot of things at once. Executives tend to focus on just a few discrete things. A legislature is a huge, many-headed body with maybe 25 or 30 committees that can take on a wide range of policies across a long stretch of time. And they're good at sort of persistent effort that way. They can take on a lot of things at once. And this means that we can be doing background work on things that are maybe not controversial, maybe never in the news, but nevertheless, we can make progress on them. It's also an opportunity for those of us working within this environment to create real public benefit. It's not always the case in government and politics that we get to make a substantive contribution and make people happier, better, safer, more productive, but we see it all the time in legislative activity. And it can be something as simple as changing a few words in a bill or adding an amendment to something that might otherwise be sort of problematic. It provides us an opportunity to, change the world for the better, which is something lots of people in social science hope to be able to do. It also lets us try out new ideas and learn about new things. One of the things I love about my job is I have a never-ending supply of discussion material for classes that I teach, because I'm constantly hit with questions about, like, what do we think about this tax policy or this healthcare policy or this education policy? And I'm constantly having to educate myself to work in this area. And trying out new ideas, like throwing new ideas out there around how we organize government and how we organize law and policy and regulation is really kind of fascinating. It's a huge puzzle. And learning how it works is gratifying in itself. And maybe the best part is the people that you work with. Most of not all, and there are, obviously bad actors in any organization, but most of the people you will work with in government, if you ever end up working in government, are earnest and sincere people who want to do something good. It's not universal, but for every one sort of like loud, obnoxious person you see, on the cable TV circuit, there are literally hundreds of other people in this organization that are trying to do good and trying to find a way to make life better. And it's a form of service that I think lots of people would benefit from, and I do encourage folks to take on as much as they can. So that's all I have presentation-wise, and come in what looks like in good time here. And so I'll be happy to answer any questions everyone has, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weikert. If anyone has any questions, if you could put them in the chat, and it looks like we may have one there now. While we're waiting on that chat, I have a couple questions that were submitted before. Dr. Weikert, can you tell us, are there any areas where parties usually agree and that the legislating piece is easy?
I would say there aren't many, but there are some. We generally find that on questions of public safety, there's usually a lot of agreement. In technical areas around something like, I'm trying to think of something like legislation around, like, riparian buffers, like the riverbanks and coasts of lakes and things like that. Like, what are the environmental regulations that should govern that? You tend not to find a lot of political infighting over narrow technical points like that. Usually the conflict comes on things that are either highly visible or highly or high politics, like the budget and appointments and electoral rules and things like that, for the simple reason that these become things that the public might care about come election time. I've often thought to myself that it might be a useful thing if we elected members swore them in and just like closed the doors and turned off the cameras and held them all incommunicado, like in a conclave, until it was time to run for re-election again, and just let people sort of like, evaluate the work product instead of watching how it happens. Because when you're trying to do your job under like this Klieg light of constant attention, which is what the modern media world gives us, it becomes hard to do. And there's not really time to sort of test out ideas and try out new partnerships and things like that. So visibility is often counterproductive for legislatures because they do their best work when sort of left alone. And we just don't have that world anymore.
So here's another question that was asked as well. There may be some students here that are interested in a career in legislative government. How do you get into that?
There are a lot of ways. The most common way I would say, well, there are two, I would say. Almost every legislative body has offices in the Capitol, of course, but they also have district offices that handle requests at the ground level. And very often these places are hiring. They will hire part-time staff. They will often hire students while they're still in school. College students, I should say. They tend to not hire minors in high school, but it's probably not unprecedented. And that's a good way to get into it. You would usually come in doing constituent service and casework. You might find yourself working for a legislature because you've worked with political campaigns, and you might find a candidate who becomes an elected official who wants you around and offers you a job that way. And sometimes people come to it through sort of the technical side. If you study law or attend law school, you may end up working for a government You might work for the executive branch and sort of shift over to the legislature and what have you. But there are a lot of avenues into legislative government, and they're all quite exciting.
Thank you. So here's another one from Dr. Kitkowski. And her work with 211 back in 1998 to 2000, the telecommunications bill was able to have a 211 look favorable via the amendment. And she said someone called it a Christmas tree amendment. Is that a common term, and is it used readily? A Christmas tree amendment.
Yeah, a Christmas tree bill is sometimes just a bill that exists in a very basic form. And what happens is that it will start getting lots of amendments attached to it. And sometimes, depending on the rules of the chamber, the amendments have to be germane and relevant to the bill itself. So, for example, if it's an education bill, then the amendments have to be related to education. But if the Rules Committee doesn't establish that, or the rules in general don't require that, what can end up happening is you end up with bills with lots of things attached to them that have almost nothing to do with the bill. And in fact, you can end up with amendments that actually completely change the meaning of the bill at all. You might start with something whose goal is to promote volunteerism around recruiting poll workers. And you might end up with something that makes it harder for people to actually volunteer to become a poll worker, depending on how the language gets changed in the process. So that Christmas tree bill, Christmas tree amendment term is not unusual. It's also used because we have this mental image of a Christmas tree with all these ornaments hanging off of it. And if you put one too many on it, it will top over, it'll knock other things off. And so that can create a problem as well. So yeah, not terribly uncommon.
And Randy Pertolis gives us something to think about here. He said, what hope is there for the U.S. congressional legislative integrity as long as most politicians are tethered to the endless cycle of needing to raise more money for election campaigns?
It is concerning. The amount of time legislators spend raising money. And again, I should point out, not all legislators, many are either in safe seats where they don't really need to raise much money, or they simply don't do it because they find it distasteful, or because they choose to run lower cost campaigns. It really should say that at least outside of the federal level, lots of campaigns can be run with not more than a few $1,000s and doing nothing more than knocking a lot of doors and hitting the pavement and talking to people. The very first House campaign I worked with, that was the advice I gave them. It was a relatively compact urban district. And I said, look, you can spend a lot of money on advertising, and that's going to be costly, and that's going to suck up your resources and chew up your time. Or you can simply just brute force knock every door in this district, and you'll probably do okay. And they did, and they kept repeating that process going forward. The question of the effect of money on campaigns and on politics in general, though, is a more complex one. It is problematic that politicians raise so much money. And it's problematic that it gives the appearance of corruption. I should say, as a political scientist, that we don't find a lot of evidence that of like corrupt outcomes. In other words, a candidate receives a lot of donations from a particular interest. We don't generally find that they then act contrary to what their beliefs were or their policy positions were before they took those donations. Generally, what's happening is that these interest groups and lobbyists are identifying members and candidates who already agree with them and donate money to them to help them get elected. And so it's not necessarily the case that we're talking about corruption or lack of integrity on the part of the legislators. It's just that outside money is distorting the kind of people who tend to get elected, if that makes sense to everybody. I don't think it's better in terms of outcome. It is still a problem that the policy agenda of more affluent interests is the one that tends to be represented in government. But it should at least make us feel a little better around this idea that, well, our politicians are being bought. That's generally not the case. It is also not always the case that the best funded candidate wins. In lots of elections, in fact, in most elections, there is no particular relationship between the amount of money a candidate spends and how they perform once you hit a certain minimum level of self-sufficiency, which, as I've said, for state house and senate races might only be a few $1,000s. It's obviously more for a federal house or federal senate race, or a race for the presidency we won't even touch. We're talking billions of dollars at that point. But once you have enough money in a campaign, more doesn't give you a better chance of winning. That isn't to say we shouldn't seek to limit the power of contributions and the power of donors. We absolutely should. It's really more a question of, do we have other political challenges, structural challenges that would do more to fix than this would. In other words, it would take a lot of efforts to meaningfully reform the campaign finance system. It genuinely would. Would that effort be better spent doing something like eliminating partisan gerrymandering, which we know contributes significantly and in an incredibly corrosive way to lots of political problems? So if we have to pick and choose, and we usually do, sort of where is our effort best put? Is it in reforming campaign finance, or is it reforming gerrymandering, for example?
Jolie Bell would like to know, do you think that the constant media attention that we see increases accountability?
It can, but we need to remember that media outlets are private, in almost all cases, are private institutions who have a powerful profit motive, which means they want to tell a compelling story. This doesn't generally make for good watchdog journalism. It's kind of fun. I work in political communication. I can only assume it's because they have a lot of state-sponsored media, but the Scandinavian countries pay a lot of attention to media content analysis and what's on their news and everything else and its effects. So it's kind of funny, almost every time I travel to a conference, on my panel is me and like 8 people named Sven and Annika. And one of the things that stands out when they talk about media coverage and news coverage is that media and news for them are synonymous. In other words, almost all of what's on their airwaves and in their print is actually news. In other words, it's fact-based, it's objective, it's not, opinionated, and it has high standards of high standards for fact-checking and ethical accountability. In American media, we can't say media and news we can't represent them as being synonymous because something like 90% of all media output in the United States is opinion and punditry as opposed to news. And it's not so much that we did away with news, it's that news is still where it always was. News is, the main, broadcast news outlets, their nightly news broadcasts. That's pretty much all news. You will see the occasional editorial or analytical piece. The front page of most newspapers, still mostly news, right? But the challenge we face in the US is that we also have these cable news outlets, which are overwhelmingly editorial content. I think, Fox News and MSNBC, I think between them in a 24-hour cycle, between both networks, will air about an hour and 10 minutes of actual news. And the other, 46 and a half hours of combined coverage is all editorial. And we can't rightly even say that that's an example of bias, because bias only exists with an expectation of objectivity. And punditry and opinion coverage is not meant to be objective. It's like complaining because that a documentary isn't objective. It's like, well, it's not designed to be. So when it comes to sort of like media accountability, it really depends who we're talking about and what kind of news product we're talking about. If most of your media accountability is taking the form of partisan and subjective attacks, and with no real threshold for whether for quality or truthfulness or accuracy, then it might be better than nothing, but that's a relatively low bar to clear. We can't rely on it quite as readily as you can in other countries.
Dr. Weikert, you really have people thinking here. I have a few more questions before we end. Great critical thinking, everyone. Dr. Carminati would like to know, what would you consider the greatest point that the legislators are struggling with when it comes to student loan forgiveness?
There are two. On the one hand, in terms of substantive policy, it can be challenging to know what is the best solution for this that is not a Band-Aid solution that just satisfies the problem for right this moment. In other words, what kind of reforms can you propose? And I've written on this. I've written policy and position papers on it. There are approaches to this that are they sort of solve the problem now and forever. So for example, let's say we passed a law that says, first of all, we abolish private student loan lending, and we say all student loan lending comes out of the US Treasury and the Department of Education, and the interest rate is capped at whatever the federal funds rate is. And if you have existing loans right now, you can refinance those into one of these, Department of Ed loans. And now the problem is solved forever. Okay, because every new loan has a relatively low interest rate. The Treasury yields a small return, and existing loans, people who've already, taken out loans, can find a way to resolve their situation. So that's a comprehensive solution. But others would point out, well, okay, but that still doesn't do anything about, the effect of loans on college tuition. And we have good evidence that it drives up college tuition. And so how do you, should you require that universities submit to some kind of federal oversight over their tuition and pricing policies? Well, have you now just created a whole regime that is now going to create a whole new bureaucracy that is going to be very opaque and tough to understand? So we have a genuine policy problem in terms of trying to identify what the best fix is. Then we have a larger political problem around the policy communication around it, where some people will say, well, why are this feels very regressive, right? People who attend college are often middle class, upper middle class, or, wealthy individuals. Why are we creating a problem that's going to overwhelmingly benefit, the wealthy? And then you can have the counterpoint, which is, well, actually 40% of all attendees qualified for Pell Grants and didn't come from privileged backgrounds. But now we're debating sort of worthiness or whether it's right or wrong. And these are tougher questions as well. So within a legislature, I'm not sure there's exactly one solution, but I would say if we could reach some kind of consensus, if we had some outside expert and objective agency or body who came up with what we would consider sort of the gold standard solution, then at least we would have something to work towards on the legislative side. And once you get to that, it just leaves the political fight, which is sometimes a matter of timing.
Thank you. Sister Ann would like to know, you mentioned two characteristics of success in legislation, positional power and likability. Are there other characteristics you could highlight that drive success?
There are two, and one is rather unfortunate and the other is rather fortunate, and they're both sort of demographic related. It is still the case that non-white members tend to have less success at advancing their legislative agendas. We've confirmed this with studies dating back to the late 80s, early 90s, right up through, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. I'm thinking of a paper I just completed. And this still seems to be the case. What's not clear is whether this is a vestige of racial disadvantage, or is it because minority members tend to represent districts that also tend to be poorer on average, and poorer districts tend to be less well represented in legislatures. So in other words, this is not necessarily a race-based problem. It could simply be, a function of, an artifact of where these members come from. It is also the case that female legislators seem to be doing better than male legislators recently. When we look at this as again, just sort of as a feature of an individual legislator, that demographics do seem to matter. And depending on whether we're looking at the US or in other countries and where in the US, we also find that women in legislatures tend to behave differently. They tend to pursue different kinds of policies than predominantly male legislatures. And so there are elements that go along with that. I have not found evidence that serving longer in a legislature matters in terms of success, except at the very sort of extreme levels. If you've been around, for 25, 30 years and you're by seniority getting lots of sort of like committee chairmanships and things like that, or positions of leadership, then you're going to have advantages. But for example, someone who served 5 years is not necessarily less effective than someone who has served 10 years. So, yeah.
And last question is from Dr. Gordon Mercer. And he says, are there any truly unique committees in some states that are having a major impact? He mentions California seems to be doing more on electric vehicles, and some legislatures are establishing weather committees.
There are, and that's where you find, when we think of sort of interesting committees or unique committees, they tend to be focusing on issues that are of particular importance to that state. For example, I know that I'm pretty sure forgive me, it's a Midwest state. I don't mean to be like a coastal elite here and imply they're all the same, but it's either Nebraska or Iowa. They have a committee related to the study of drought. And this is of particular importance because they're a heavily agricultural state. And that's what it tends to be. It's some particularist or some especially localized problem or issue that is fairly unique for that state.
And we did have one last question that came in. We want to make sure that we have an answer for this one too. Jobert Padada has said, you mentioned the United States legislature is a majority cartel. What are the measures to limit tyranny of the majority in a bipartisan legislature?
There are some measures, and a couple I've actually worked on myself. For example, a rule change that would guarantee every member basically a fast track pass that would guarantee one bill for each legislative session, a vote in committee, and a debate on the floor. And if you give every member one of those, then all of a sudden you have to have the debate, because one of the ways majorities tend to keep control of the process is just by never having a debate on bills that they think would be popular, but which they don't want to support. So this is a way of getting a bill in front of the whole legislature and forcing them to debate it in public and forcing folks to take a vote on the record for it. Another would be around co-sponsorships. When a bill is proposed, members circulate a co-sponsorship petition or a co-sponsorship memo, and it describes the purpose of the bill and everything else and asks people to sign on to it as a show of support. Well, lots of members, if you're going to be a cynical person, are co-sponsoring lots of bills, in part because they know they will never get out of committee. So they get to claim credit for having supported it as a co-sponsor, but didn't actually have to vote for it and enact it into law or vote against it to oppose it. So for example, in Pennsylvania, we had 2 bills around eliminating partisan gerrymandering that had, I think it was 118 or 125 co-sponsors, so bipartisan co-sponsors, enough co-sponsors, in fact, that if they all voted yes, it would have passed the House, but it never got out of committee. And so you can change the rules that say any bill that has at least 20 co-sponsors from each party is guaranteed a debate on the floor and a vote on the floor. So there are ways of doing this, but it requires legislatures to commit to rules that make the process more open. And very often they do not want to do that. It makes it harder to manage the chamber. And sometimes that's in goodwill or in good faith, where like they recognize they don't want a chaotic chamber where there's constant action, but it's too often used in bad faith to prevent bills that would otherwise be very popular from getting a debate and a vote.
Oh, wow. Interesting dialogue, Dr. Weikert. We want to thank you. That has brought us to the end of all of our questions and almost the end of our time together. But Dr. Weikert, we want to thank you for attending and providing this stimulating presentation today. The program has been recorded, and for anyone that wants to see it, it can be found on the Pi Gamma Mu website, as well as on the YouTube channel for Pi Gamma Mu. We have our own channel now, so we're proud of that. So for those attending today that are Pi Gamma Mu members, we hope you've enjoyed the presentation and that we see you at our triennial convention in Philadelphia in November, as Suzanne has talked about in the beginning of this presentation. For those of you who are attending that are not Pi Gamma Mu members, please go to our Pi Gamma Mu website and you can find more information about how to become a member and how to join through the chapter at your university. And I know that you have some additional information for us about our upcoming speaker who is actually with us today. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's happening next in April.
Yes, thank you, President Kinsella. The next event in our speaker series will be held on Friday, April 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And Dr. Laura Rodriguez-Kitkowski, who's here on the screen with us today, will be presenting on a topic that undoubtedly impacts us all: stress and coping, taking care of you. Dr. Kitkowski notes that in work, as well as in life outside of work, challenges, including the pandemic, have called for us all to look at how we cope. That what we do today varies from what we did before, and that the threshold for stress has dramatically changed. Dr. Rodriguez-Kitkowski is the faculty chapter sponsor of the Georgia Sigma chapter of Pi Gamma Mu and is a professor for South University, where she is the department chair of psychology. She's also in private practice and holds and has held leadership positions in several professional organizations. So you won't want to miss her presentation on stress and coping on April 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And thank you again, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Dr. Kinsella, Dr. Joshua Weikert, for your excellent presentation today on politics and public policy in legislatures. That wraps up things for today, and we hope to see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.